Welcome back, everyone. Grab a seat and enjoy the vibe for another drawing session. In today's video, we're drawing not one, but two stone golems. Sounds crazy, right? I know. First, the one I used for the video thumbnail. For the second one, which is actually the main content of the video, I wanted to try and make something huge and super loaded with details. Let us see how it turned out. I leave you with the process from the very beginning. Like any good creative process, we are starting this character design with a brainstorming session. The goal now is to explore the concept until the canvas is filled with tiny sketches. Ideally, that should be enough to find an idea I like. This is easily one of my favorite stages of the project. It is a moment of pure freedom where every path is open, allowing me to make mistakes without consequences before locking myself into a definitive concept. I do not want to make just any generic golem, though. I seek to create a giant whose size rivals that of a literal mountain. This is a creature of living rock that not only mimics a mountain's appearance, but embodies its very essence. To highlight the immensity of this guy, I am exploring the idea of scattering things like towers, windmills, or trees across its stone body. These tiny elements will serve as a visual reference to emphasize the colossal scale of the character. Without a doubt, one advantage of creating an amorphous stone creature is the absolute freedom it gives you to draw its anatomy. Since it does not follow any fixed rules, you can give it any shape you want and it will still be a perfectly fine golem, because every stone body is valid. And with that, I conclude the brainstorming session. Now it's time to choose the concept that will set the course for the illustration. Although I quite like the blue golem with the windmills, or this other one with the volcanoes and medieval vibe, I'm going to go with this one right here. Its shape is just fun, and I think it will give me plenty of room to play with as I dive deeper into its concept. On the other hand, I love this small detail of the stairs from that other design. It looks simple, but it adds a lot and reinforces the idea of verticality, a concept I want to be very prominent in this character. Now we move on to what is, without a doubt, my favorite part. It is time to develop the final character design in depth. To test out what elements work and what don't, I start with a static frontal pose. This is a very useful middle step before jumping straight into the final composition. Broadly speaking, the character is split into 3 floors to emphasize that sense of verticality, allowing each one to tell a unique story. For the head, I want to use triangular shapes to reinforce the idea that it represents a mountain peak. Using angular shapes can also help give it a touch of Nordic aesthetic, which fits perfectly since this upper zone represents a cold, alpine environment. The torso is inspired by a mountainside, where the golem's tiny inhabitants would hypothetically hang out. I intend to decorate this area with elements like windmills, trees, or crops to bring that miniature world to life, completely defying gravity by sitting perpendicular to the horizon. This is a creative license that works perfectly for a magical creature. In fact, this midsection reminds me of Animal Crossing, specifically how the land noticeably curves as if resting on a massive rolling log. I love this direction, as I want the peace and calm of that game to define this part of the design. At the bottom, I place, somewhat randomly, different stone structures that act in part as armor. an idea inspired by Shadow of the Colossus, where the creatures carry stone shapes on their bodies that remind me of ancient temples. These ruin fragments are meant to convey that they belong to a past civilization, evoking the aesthetic of half-buried architectural remains. For the face, a pretty cool idea came up. A sort of altar with runes surrounding the face, like this ancient energy is what's actually bringing the creature to life. Incorporating runes also perfectly anchors the Nordic aesthetic I was aiming for in this area. Adding this last magical detail wraps up the exploratory stage, leaving me with a solid base to finally dive into the main composition. Before I start drawing, I lay down some guidelines to lock in the perspective. Essentially, I build these guides from a 100-point star whose center collapses into a single point. Then I drag that center off the canvas until it's in the position I want. This center acts basically as a vanishing point, and I repeat this process 3 times to set up a 3-point perspective. In a way, it's the stars themselves guiding my path in this drawing. Isn't that just poetic? With this, I'm looking to establish a specific framing that reinforces the massive scale of the character, placing the viewer almost at ground level with an extreme low-angle view that forces their gaze straight up. Transferring the previous front view sketch to this new perspective is quite challenging, especially fitting the different elements decorating the character's arms and legs. However, the effort is totally worth it. Even at this early stage, the sketch already looks imposing. Or maybe not so much. Maybe I'm not being objective. Maybe, just maybe, I'm looking at it through the eyes of a proud mother. Who knows?
Would my mother be proud of me? I hope so, but in my heart of hearts, oh boy.
Between the circular engravings and the rocks where the runes will be inscribed surrounding the face, I prefer to leave some breathing room. If I enclose the face in a complete circle, it would look incredibly weird, disconnecting it from the rest of the head as if the character were wearing a mountain-shaped astronaut helmet, and I definitely don't want that. In the end, I decided on a spiral staircase configuration that wraps around the arms and legs. It looks a bit cleaner than just putting down staircases that cross each other at random. Plus, the way they are positioned suggests the idea of being the direct access path to the upper level. I'd like to make a quick detour here. To be completely honest, drawing the windmill blades in this perspective was way harder than I'd care to admit. If this is the side view of the windmill, the blade should ideally go in this direction, perpendicular to the ground. But right now, they look tilted, almost pointing directly at the viewer. On the other hand, the windmill in the background doesn't have this issue at all. If we try highlighting the blades, we can see they have a pretty basic shape.
Oopsie daisy, let's just leave the explanation at that.
About the runes, they supposedly carry a deep meaning that matches the golem's personality. In reality, I just grabbed them from a random Pinterest image without double-checking anything. I didn't really care enough to look into it, so I just picked them because they looked cool. But hey, you can pretend it's deep lore. Once I have the drawing at a level of detail I'm happy with, I start adding some color. This phase is provisional, but it helps me decide which palette I want to use and see how the tones interact with each other. This way, I can go back and tweak the lines to better fit the color layer. Although it was left out of the video editing, I actually did several tests alongside the sketching process. I have only used the final test for this video. And here arrives another of my favorite stages. Or well, maybe the favorite. Yeah, it has to be the favorite one. With the sketch in the background, I start tracing the outline to clean up the chaos of those initial lines and bring a definitive shape to life. It feels like riding on rails, just gliding along the path the sketch already laid down. At this stage, I don't try to outline every single detail. I use a thick line that would add too much visual noise if applied everywhere. Right now, I focus purely on the essentials and large volumes, establishing a clear hierarchy by highlighting the main shapes. The delicate details will have their moment later with a finer stroke. An easy and effective way to bring your lines to life is by playing with line weight. That simple shift breaks the monotony and makes the stroke way more dynamic. Plus, it lets me define smaller details that would otherwise turn into a muddy black smudge if I used a constant brush size. Although it's something I usually do once the line work is finished, I love breaking the rigidity of the lines by erasing small sections. Interrupting the stroke and avoiding completely closed shapes gives the drawing some breathing room. It creates a beautiful effect where the color and the background subtly blend through those tiny openings. With the sketch now cleaned up into a first version of the outline, I go back to work on it. If there are shapes that don't quite convince me, I return to the sketching brush to correct and refine them. It's a quick but necessary step to make the final adjustments before moving forward. With everything finally in place, it's time to start the line work from scratch. I could probably try to salvage the previous lines by applying the changes to the original layer, but honestly, there are so many minor adjustments that it's just worth it to start the stroke from the beginning. This way, with a polished base and without dragging any mistakes along, I redraw every single line with the clear intention that this time it will be the definitive layer. So I'll be going extra fast this time around since we've already been through this before, and I prefer not to dwell on this part. And just like that, faster than expected, we are already done with the lines and moving on to the coloring phase, where I start broadly by blocking in the tones without getting caught up in too many nuances. I focus on the largest areas first, mentally grouping the various colors the drawing will have under a single base shade. At the bottom, I use earth tones to capture the wear and tear of time. The idea is to suggest these are ancient ruins that were buried underground, only coming to light when the creature wakes up and rises. To add more visual richness, I apply different tones over the base color to incorporate new details. This process makes some of the previous lines unnecessary, as the color variations are enough to suggest those shapes. That is why, alongside the coloring process, I make small adjustments to the line work layer to adapt it to the color. A good example is the fields. It looks much cleaner to show the crops through shifts in tone luminosity, rather than marking the divisions with lines. This keeps the design uncluttered, leaving the strokes in this area solely to suggest subtle details like blades of grass. In short, while working on the color, I don't forget about the previous line work. Those lines keep adapting and changing, even if just slightly, as the project moves forward. The scarecrow detail turned out great. It's a wonderful addition to the crop area and the perfect pot for a sunflower. Not bad at all. For the mountain peak, my goal is to map out the different rock faces, creating sharp angles and well-defined edges. Adding this kind of texture is essential to break up the space, as the surface is far too large to leave as a flat, uninspired gray. Marking these details with line work doesn't really convince me, as they end up looking more like scars on the character's face than the texture I actually want to convey. Instead, I prefer to replicate this effect directly through variations in the base color, which gives me much more freedom to modulate the intensity. This stage requires quite a bit of experimentation to reach the final look. Despite that, I'm really happy with the outcome. It conveys the exact texture I'm looking for while fitting the visual style of the drawing, striking the perfect balance between being detailed and keeping the area clean and uncluttered. And with these final flower pops in place, this coloring phase is complete. We are entering the lighting process now. This is where the character takes on a whole new dimension, getting much closer to feeling alive as flat shapes finally transform. This might actually be my favorite section, or at least my second favorite, pretty much on par with the first one. I don't know. Anyway, to start, I create a general layer for a global shadow. This is just a first pass where I am not looking for precision, but rather capturing the main volumes and shapes. Once these general shapes are defined, I divide that base shading and apply it to the different elements of the design individually. This way, breaking down the work allows me to tackle the smaller details with much more comfort and control. At this point, I briefly interrupt the lighting process to incorporate a detail that will add an extra layer of interest to the lower section. Since my purpose in this area is to suggest the idea of an exposed underground zone, I decided to add small patches of color that hint at the shape of buried skeletal remains. This not only adds narrative to the environment, but being placed right next to the cave entrance creates a mysterious atmosphere reminiscent of dungeons in classic Zelda games. As the overall drawing represents a small miniature world, introducing this adventure game touch fits the concept quite well and invites the viewer to explore every detail. The butterfly fossils came together beautifully in the end, if I do say so myself. To unify the colors and simulate the ambient light color, I apply a global layer as a translucent veil over the entire composition. For aesthetics, I configure this layer so that it does not affect the shadows. This separation allows me to apply color tones to the lights and shadows independently, in addition to increasing the contrast between these two layers. On top of this veil, I place the specular highlights of the main light. This is where the veil serves a second function, as it slightly reduces the luminosity of the lighter tones. If I were to apply these highlights directly over colors that are already almost white, the effect wouldn't be noticeable. So this subtle reduction gives me the necessary margin for the flashes to pop. Later on, following the same logic as with the main light, I use a blending mode to lighten and add a secondary light. This light outlines the character's silhouette in the dark areas, a resource that adds visual richness and helps separate the character from the background, so the drawing reads much better. Another visual detail I incorporated during the lighting process was these patches of mossy vegetation spreading across the rock. Conceptually, they work really well as a transition between the green area of the drawing and the mountain peak. The problem is that, being so close to the face, these green areas can be perceived as splatters or some kind of skin rash, a completely unintended effect. Later on, I simplified the shape of the spots, but I still feel like that green makes the character look sick. In the end, I decided to leave it in the composition because it works really well to visually connect both sections, even though the result is a bit questionable.
By the way, that is not a hand. It is a tiny stone golem. Actually, he doesn't even have hands. They are just small stone golems, and I guess somehow his feet are also golems, foot-shaped stone golems, and a footnote golem.
Finally, I am painting the luminescent effect on the runes. With this touch of light, I conclude the illumination process. It is a minor detail that I do not want to spend too much time on, so the effect might not look perfectly polished. Even though it looks a bit flat right now, it helps me see how this light interacts with the background gray. Later on, I will add some texture, and with a bit of luck, that will make it look much better. Now I start coloring the line art to blend it with the local colors, starting with the thickest lines that define the main volumes. Next, I move on to the second group of lines, the thinner ones responsible for the internal details. Although I use the same color palette as the outer ones, I apply a blending mode to the layer that makes them darken automatically based on the background. This is key because, being thinner, it would be easier for them to get lost in the colors underneath. But with this adjustment, I managed to make them stand out with total clarity, adapting to the changes in tone and luminosity of the drawing. With the outlines ready, it is time to add texture and move past those initial flat colors. I know I keep repeating myself, but this is my real favorite part. For the light reflections, I select a brush with a dotted texture to generate a gradient with a noise effect, adjusting the luminosity of the highlights layer on the fly so they stand out more against the composition and make that grainy finish more visible. Just so you know, due to a small accident with the recording, I could not capture the previous step. Not a big deal, but it basically consisted of applying light brush strokes over the shadows to reduce their darkness in certain areas.
Not like anyone cares anyway. Certainly not a big deal.
Here I make a quick adjustment to add an extra touch of depth by darkening the shadows inside the cave a bit. The next step is to apply a subtle general gradient. First, I work on the shadow layer, progressively intensifying it as we get closer to the ground. To simplify the workflow, I have the base color unified through a smart object. This allows me to edit all the shadows in one place and alter the general atmosphere of the drawing in very few steps, applying the gradient that darkens the character directly from that base layer. To finish, I apply the same principle to the lights, but in reverse, creating a gradient where the illumination increases as it ascends. It is a subtle effect that complements the shadows on the ground, achieving a much more solid environmental integration across the entire character. To accompany the drawing. First, I place a geometric figure that wraps around the character to break up the flat background. To work more comfortably, I use a separate canvas with the same dimensions and a silhouette that marks the exact position of the character. When I am minimally satisfied with the geometric figure, I project a shadow from the character's silhouette to visually separate it from the background. I also apply a bit of noise texture so that it matches the grain I used on some of the brushes. The next step is to apply some gradients to blend the figure with the background. This way, the edges are not as sharp or solid. I also add a noise texture to these gradients so everything is visually unified. Now it is time to do a bit of grounding, essentially putting a shadow on the feet, at least in this case. This serves to keep the character from being disconnected from the background and makes the figure truly integrate into the space. Working on the background using the silhouette as a reference has made me reflect on the character design itself. I consider that keeping this aspect in mind when drawing, even analyzing the different designs through the silhouette alone, is a practical tool that I had not considered before. It offers me a different perspective on what I do and can help achieve more recognizable results. So it is something I want to keep in mind in the future. Lastly, some outer light lines to make the character stand out, and with that, we are ready. To be completely honest, I am not a big fan of this section. In fact, it makes me sick to my stomach. It genuinely makes me want to delete not just this file, but my whole life after it. Actually, it is not that bad. It is just not my favorite section. And frankly, those are big words. But now that we are done, let us see what I just did. Across the centuries, the selfsame tale echoed through the vales. A mountain born within a single night. A whim upon the map, a peak that rose at dawn upon shifting horizons. At first, the dwellers of the land took refuge in old myth and blamed the gates of mist. They blamed cosmic wills that, bored within the void, moved the ancient stone. Until one day, the mystery was laid bare, and the entire summit stood upon its feet. A gentle giant, kind of heart, who seemed to crave the warmth of company. Perchance he walked alone, the remnant of a vanished race, a solitary wanderer in a world no longer his own. Soon, many sought to scale this great and living mount, and high above, they found a strange marvel that defied all known law. Gravity itself would bend, granting safe passage upon the sheer vertical walls. And on the slopes of his skirted hills, small kindreds found a home. They tilled fertile fields upon the stone, ever ready to march away. Yet the soil of the Titan harbored a dark secret. The harvest reaped upon those heights possessed the power to lengthen life beyond its natural bound. But immortality bore a bitter price, for the fruit slowly turned living flesh into stone. Mighty Colossus, he knew naught of the sorrow he wrought. Struck with horror and guilt for the doom he caused, the giant chose to sink once more into deep slumber. So much time has passed that the men of today have clean forgotten, casting the lore aside as a mere magical fable. Yet many there are who still seek this titan beneath the mountains, longing to cultivate the fruit of everlasting life. Well, that is all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. See you in the next one.